The Unseen Battle. It was a tranquil evening in the small town of Willowbrook, the kind of quiet night where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional car passing by. The streets were lined with tall oak trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze as the streetlights flickered on, casting a soft glow over the peaceful neighborhood. The air was cool, and there was an undercurrent of calm that suggested everything was as it should be. Nina Morrison walked down the sidewalk with a purpose, her briefcase in hand. She had just finished a long day at the district attorney's office, where she had been tirelessly defending the rights of the voiceless. As a state prosecutor, Nia had earned respect among her colleagues for her fierce dedication to justice. She had spent years in the courtroom fighting for fairness, often putting her own life on hold for the sake of others. But tonight, she was looking forward to something different. A night out with friends, away from the courthouse and the weight of her responsibilities. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she walked toward her destination, her thoughts momentarily drifting to the dinner plans she had ahead. There was something about the thought of laughter and good food with close friends that felt like the perfect way to unwind. The tension of the courtroom, the stressful hours, the never-ending cases, all of it seemed to fade as she imagined herself enjoying a rare night of peace. Nia had grown used to the constant scrutiny that came with her position. As a black woman in a predominantly white profession, she had faced her share of racial bias. Subtle assumptions about her intelligence, her capabilities, and her role in the legal field followed her everywhere. Yet, she had learned to navigate these hurdles, rising above them with grace and determination. Tonight, however, she wasn't thinking about those struggles. Tonight, she simply wanted to enjoy herself, to let go of the weight she carried every day. But fate had a different plan in store. Sergeant William Cartwright sat behind the wheel of his police patrol car, parked in the shadows of a quiet street. The blue lights were off, and the car blended into the darkened backdrop of the neighborhood. His shift had been uneventful so far, a few minor traffic stops, and a missing dog report. It wasn't anything that sparked excitement, but it was his job. A job he had taken years ago with idealism. He had wanted to protect the innocent, to serve his community. But somewhere along the way, his optimism had been replaced by suspicion, by an ingrained cynicism that clouded his view of the world. As he sat, his mind wandered back to the reports he had been reading earlier, stories of petty thefts, burglaries, and suspicious activity in the area. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the street. That's when he saw her. Nia Morrison. She walked alone, a woman in her late 30s, confident, poised, and dressed in a professional outfit that immediately marked her as someone of importance. She was well-dressed, and her stride was purposeful, the kind of walk that told you she belonged somewhere. Yet there was something about her presence that didn't sit right with him. He hadn't seen her in this neighborhood before, and she wasn't someone he would typically expect to see walking alone at night. The thought crossed his mind almost immediately. She doesn't belong here. Cartwright's gaze lingered on her as she passed, his mind quickly jumping to conclusions. He didn't know who she was, but in his experience, women walking alone in such a pristine neighborhood were often hiding something. Maybe she was just out for a walk, or maybe there was more to the story. He couldn't help but wonder. A shadow of suspicion crept into his mind as he turned on the patrol car's lights, the harsh blue glow cutting through the calm of the night. He stepped out of the car with a grunt, his boots making a firm sound against the pavement as he approached her. "Hey," he called out, his voice firm, yet laced with a suspicion that was almost palpable. Nia's heart skipped a beat as she stopped in her tracks, surprised by the sudden interruption. She turned slowly, her mind racing, but her face remaining composed. The officer's presence, especially at this hour, was no accident, and it wasn't lost on her that he was addressing her. She had been stopped by the police before, countless times in fact, but never in such an innocuous setting. The question of why lingered in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. "Yes, officer," Nia asked, her voice calm, controlled, though a sharp edge of unease lingered beneath the surface. Cartwright's eyes narrowed as he studied her for a moment, his gaze tracing the clean lines of her business suit and the firm way she carried herself. She looked like someone who belonged, yet there was something unsettling about it. Something didn't sit right. "I need to see some identification," he ordered, his voice flat, like this was routine. Yet his eyes were less focused on her face and more on the pocket of her jacket, her purse. Every movement she made seemed to draw his attention in a way that made her skin prickle. Nia's pulse quickened. There was no reason for this. She hadn't done anything wrong. But even as she bristled, she reminded herself that remaining calm was the key. She had spent years honing the ability to de-escalate, to stay in control even when the situation seemed to be spiraling. "Officer, is there a problem?" she asked, her voice still even, though her heart was beginning to race. The question was met with an abrupt shake of his head. "Where are you coming from?" Cartwright demanded. "You don't belong here." The words stung more than she expected. Nia clenched her jaw, biting back the frustration that began to rise within her. She had spent so many years working to be seen as more than just the color of her skin, and now, here she was, being reduced to nothing more than a suspicion based on a set of assumptions that had nothing to do with her reality. "I'm on my way to meet some friends for dinner," Nia said, choosing her words carefully. "I work just a few blocks away at the district attorney's office. I'm a state prosecutor." Cartwright's eyes hardened. He hadn't expected her to respond so calmly. And when she mentioned her job, a slight sneer curled on his lips. "State prosecutor, huh? Heard that one before. Doesn't mean much. Could have picked that ID up anywhere." Nia's fingers tightened around her briefcase, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm not lying, officer. You can check my ID if you'd like." She didn't want to escalate this further, but the officer's tone was full of suspicion, and she could feel the weight of each second stretching between them. She reached into her purse, calmly withdrawing her ID and handing it to him. She expected him to glance at it and let her go, but he didn't. Cartwright barely looked at the ID before turning his eyes back to her. "You could have stolen this," he muttered, as if he hadn't even heard the words she had spoken. Her frustration began to mount, but Nia kept her composure, even as she felt the familiar sting of being doubted. She was an accomplished professional, a prosecutor. And yet here she was, being treated like a suspect for no reason other than her skin color. She could feel the tension thickening in the air as Cartwright took another step forward. "Anything else in that purse I should know about?" he asked, his hand resting on his belt, hovering dangerously close to his weapon. Nia's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't show it. "No, officer. Just personal items." Cartwright's suspicion didn't ease. In fact, it only deepened. The moment had shifted. This was no longer about asking questions. It was about asserting control. And just like that, Nia realized what she was up against. This wasn't a random stop. This wasn't an officer doing his job. This was about something much deeper, something that she had fought against her entire life. Without warning, Cartwright's hand hovered over his radio. He was about to escalate things, to call for backup. But Nia wasn't about to let this moment define her. She had fought too hard, come too far, and stood too tall to be brought down by prejudice and assumptions. "Officer, you have no right to search me without probable cause," she said, her voice no longer calm, but resolute. Cartwright's gaze flickered for a moment, his grip tightening on his radio as the tension hung heavy in the night air. This wasn't going to end quietly, and neither of them could have anticipated what would happen next. The clash of convictions. The street remained still, save for the distant hum of traffic that seemed worlds away from the escalating standoff between Nia Morrison and Sergeant William Cartwright. Nia's heart thudded in her chest, her mind racing, yet her body stood still, rooted to the spot by a mix of indignation and resolve. She was no stranger to discrimination, having spent most of her career as a prosecutor pushing against biases in the courtroom. But this moment felt different. It wasn't just about fighting for justice in the legal system anymore. It was about fighting for her very humanity. And she was determined not to lose. Cartwright's hand hovered over his radio, his knuckles white as they gripped the device. But for a moment, time seemed to slow. His gaze flickered over Nia's calm, unwavering posture, his mind trying to reconcile the image of the confident professional woman before him with the one he had assumed her to be just moments ago. The suspicion, the unspoken narrative he had constructed in his mind about her being out of place, about her being a potential threat, had cracked. It was there, hidden behind the uniform and the badge, but the doubt was unmistakable now. Yet, instead of retreating or offering an apology, his sense of pride flared up. The officer's internal conflict was palpable. He had assumed control of the situation, assumed her guilt, and now she was challenging him, challenging everything he believed to be true. Cartwright wasn't accustomed to being questioned, especially not by someone he considered beneath his authority, and certainly not in such an assertive, unyielding manner. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them seemed to hum with the tension of an impending explosion, the kind of moment when words could either shatter the confrontation or fuel the flames of animosity. "I'm not asking, Mom," Cartwright growled finally, breaking the silence. "I'm telling you, let me search your bag, or I'll have no choice but to take you down to the station." His words were laced with the kind of arrogance that only someone deeply entrenched in their assumptions could wield. He had made up his mind about her, and no amount of reason was going to shake that certainty. He was ready to escalate this, to make her prove her innocence the hard way, and in doing so, he believed he would reassert his authority, his control. The problem was that Nia wasn't going to back down. "I've done nothing wrong." Nia's voice rang out, sharper now. She had long ago learned that remaining passive in moments like this only allowed the biases to flourish. "You don't have the right to search me without probable cause. I'm not consenting to a search." The words were final, a declaration of rights, a boundary she was setting in stone. She was done playing by his rules, following his script. For years, Nia had been in a profession where power was often abused, where bias was woven into the fabric of the system. And this was no different. This was about more than just one officer's overreach. It was about the system that had enabled that overreach to flourish unchecked. The officer's nostrils flared as his eyes narrowed. His hand hovered over the radio again, but he hesitated. Nia could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to call for backup, wanted to escalate, but something, perhaps the faintest crack in his previously unshakable certainty, made him pause. Nia's hands were steady as she held her ground. She was used to the pressure. It was what she did every day in the courtroom. Fight for justice in spaces where people like her were often dismissed, marginalized, and ignored. But here, tonight, it wasn't a case. It was real life. It wasn't a trial with witnesses and facts. It was an encounter on the street, with her own life on the line. She could hear footsteps approaching, the faint shuffle of someone walking closer. She turned her head slightly, catching the movement of another patrol car pulling up on the street, its headlights cutting through the quiet darkness. Her shoulders tensed, but not out of fear. If anything, a strange sense of hope crept into her chest. She didn't want this to escalate further, but a part of her was praying for an intervention. Out of the car stepped another officer, an older man with graying hair and a tired expression. His uniform was a bit rumpled from a long shift, but there was an air of authority around him, a calmness that seemed to diffuse the mounting tension. His name tag read Officer Daniels. "What's going on here?" Daniels asked, his voice even, yet with an edge that suggested he knew the stakes. He looked first at Nia, then to Cartwright, his gaze flicking between the two with a quiet but perceptive analysis of the situation. Cartwright was quick to respond, his voice sharp and defensive. "She's refusing to comply with my request. Won't show me her ID, won't let me search her purse. She's acting suspicious." Nia's eyes flicked to Officer Daniels, silently imploring him to recognize what was happening, to see the gravity of the situation. She didn't need him to intervene out of sympathy. She needed him to act on the principles he had sworn to uphold: fairness, justice, respect. Daniels, after a moment's consideration, turned his gaze to Nia, his expression softening as he took in the details, the way she held herself, the professionalism that emanated from her. He could see it in her face. She was calm, but her eyes spoke volumes. She was tired. Tired of having to prove herself, tired of being seen as less than, tired of having her identity questioned. "Can I see your ID, ma'am?" Daniels asked, his tone more measured, almost apologetic. He wasn't trying to make excuses for Cartwright, but the shift in his demeanor was clear. He wasn't going to escalate this further. Nia nodded and reached into her purse, her movements deliberate. She handed him her ID, which he took without hesitation. He glanced at it briefly, then his eyebrows raised slightly in recognition as he read her name aloud. Nia Morrison, State Prosecutor's Office. He looked back at her, a brief flicker of understanding passing across his face. "I've seen your name before," Daniels said softly, his voice now much quieter, more respectful. "I know who you are. You're a prosecutor." Cartwright's face twisted in disbelief, the conviction still burning behind his eyes. "I don't care who she says she is. She's acting like she has something to hide. Why won't she let me search her bag?" Daniel's posture shifted slightly as he moved closer to Cartwright, his voice now firm, but low. "Sergeant, you're pushing this too far. She's a prosecutor, for crying out loud. If we keep pressing this, it could blow up in our faces. You know how these things go." The words hit Cartwright like a slap, but his pride held him in place. He wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. His eyes darted from Nia to Daniels, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crept into his mind. But his internal resistance remained strong, the weight of his own biases too heavy to shake completely. Nia, standing silently between them, felt a surge of frustration rise up her throat. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't about a simple request for ID. This was about how she had been seen the moment she stepped into this neighborhood. Suspect, outsider, unworthy of trust. It was the familiar sting of being judged based on the color of her skin, and it hurt just as much now as it had every other time in her life. "Officer Daniels," Nia began, her voice steady but firm. "I appreciate your professionalism, but this is not just a misunderstanding. Sergeant Cartwright here treated me like a criminal from the moment he saw me. He assumed I was guilty because of the way I look. That's not just a mistake. That's a problem." Daniel shifted his weight, his face showing signs of discomfort. He glanced at Cartwright, then back to Nia. The conflict within him was evident. Cartwright's behavior was extreme, and Daniels knew it. He could feel the weight of Nia's words. They were heavier than any badge or uniform. "I understand your frustration, ma'am," Daniels said slowly, his voice apologetic but careful. "But—" "No," Nia interrupted, her voice rising just slightly, fueled by years of pent-up frustration. "You don't understand. You don't understand what it's like to be judged for something you can't control. You don't understand how exhausting it is to constantly have to prove your worth just because of the color of your skin." There was a long silence, the kind that felt like an eternity. Cartwright was still fuming, his fists clenched at his sides, his pride bruised, but Nia's words hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. The street was still quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. For a moment, it seemed like time itself had stopped. And in that silence, Nia stood tall, unwavering, her conviction a quiet but powerful force. But it was clear that this moment would change everything. The story that had begun with a simple walk down the street had evolved into something much larger. A confrontation that reached beyond the two officers, beyond Willowbrook, and into the heart of a broken system. What would happen next would determine whether this moment was just another flash, a moment of reckoning. The silence between Nia and Officer Cartwright was thick, palpable, like the air before a storm. Her words hung in the night, heavy with the weight of years spent fighting against an unjust system. one that often saw her as less than, as suspect, simply because of the color of her skin. Her hands trembled ever so slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer exhaustion of having to constantly prove herself, to remind the world that she deserved to be treated with the same respect as anyone else. Yet tonight, in this moment, that respect was something she had to demand, even if it meant facing the uncomfortable truth that so many before her had already faced, being judged based on nothing more than the biases of those in power. Officer Daniels stood a few steps away, watching the tension rise between them, a conflict forming within him. He had seen this before. He had seen the way bias shaped the interactions of law enforcement with communities of color, and the knowledge of that history weighed heavily on his conscience. But he wasn't sure how to bridge the gap between the old guard, like Cartwright, and the changes that had yet to truly take root in the force. "I get it," Daniels said softly, his voice filled with a quiet but sincere sympathy. "I really do. But you also need to understand." He faltered, trying to find the right words. "Sergeant Cartwright is, well, he's set in his ways." Nia's gaze flicked to Cartwright, her eyes steady, unwavering. "I don't need you to explain him to me, Officer Daniels," she said firmly, her voice a soft but powerful echo of all the frustration she had lived through. "I need you to understand that what happened tonight isn't just a misunderstanding. This is a reflection of something deeper, something much bigger than this moment." The officer's eyes shifted uneasily, and Nia could sense the internal tug-of-war playing out within him. But it wasn't just Daniels who had to come to terms with this encounter. It was Cartwright, too, who had to reckon with his own biases, with the assumptions he had made about Nia simply because of how she looked. The real question, though, was whether Cartwright would even see it. For a long moment, neither officer spoke. The street around them had become a theater, with only the occasional sound of rustling leaves and distant cars moving through the stillness. But in Nia's mind, the weight of the moment was becoming unbearable. This was more than a mere traffic stop or a case of mistaken identity. This was a manifestation of the systemic racism she had battled against her entire career. She had been taught to fight in the courtroom, to challenge false narratives, to demand accountability. But out here, on the street, there was no judge, no jury. There was only her and Cartwright, and in that moment, it felt like her very existence had been placed on trial. "You have no idea what it's like to be me," Nia continued, her voice steady, but cutting through the air like a blade. "To live every single day with this weight, this constant, unspoken need to prove that I belong here, that I deserve to take up space, to have my voice heard. You don't know how exhausting it is to show up day after day and still be treated as if I'm not enough. As if the color of my skin is a reason for suspicion." Her words hung in the air, piercing the silence between them, and for the first time, Daniels seemed to hesitate. His gaze shifted from Cartwright to Nia, and the old officer could feel the unease creeping up his spine. Cartwright was still bristling, the tightness in his posture a clear sign that he wasn't about to back down. His grip on his belt tightened, his pride fighting against the reality that Nia had just challenged everything he believed to be true. "You don't know how many times I've seen people like you," Cartwright muttered, his words laced with frustration. "People like you who think they're above the law. People who think just because they have a title or a degree, they can walk around like they own the place." Nia's eyes narrowed as she locked onto him. "People like me." Her voice dropped, cold and cutting. "What exactly does that mean, Sergeant? What is it about me that makes me a threat in your eyes?" Cartwright looked away, his jaw tight, and for a moment, it seemed as though he would say more. But the words never came. Instead, he stood there, his pride still burning, but unable to answer her with any sense of truth. Officer Daniels, meanwhile, shifted his stance, his frustration growing as he looked between his colleague and Nia. "Sergeant, I'm going to have to ask you to step back," Daniels said firmly, his tone no longer apologetic but commanding. "You're not helping this situation. We're done here." For a moment, Cartwright stiffened, a muscle in his jaw twitching with anger. But he didn't argue. He stood there, silent and seething, unable to reconcile the officer he wanted to be with the one he had become. "I'm going to let you go, Mom," Daniel said to Nia, his voice more respectful now. "I apologize for the trouble." Nia nodded, but she wasn't ready to walk away just yet. "I don't want an apology, Officer Daniels. What happened tonight isn't about a simple mistake. It's about a system that treats people differently based on the way they look. It's about biases that are ingrained into every facet of our society, including the very system that's supposed to protect us." Daniels nodded, his face reflecting the weight of her words. "I understand," he said quietly. "But you have to understand." He hesitated, thinking, not everyone in the force is like Cartwright. Some of us are trying to make things right. Nia paused, taking a breath. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that change was possible. But after years of fighting these battles in courtrooms, after seeing so many times how the system failed people like her, she couldn't bring herself to take his words at face value. "I appreciate that, Officer," Nia replied, her voice still firm, but carrying the sense of resolve. "But it's not enough to just try. The system needs to be overhauled. The assumptions, the prejudices, it all needs to be addressed, and it needs to happen now, not later." She didn't wait for a response, turning to leave, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of the moment pressing down on her as she walked away from the scene. But as she walked, she also felt a sense of release, a quiet but undeniable strength in knowing that she had stood her ground. She hadn't let Cartwright break her spirit. She hadn't allowed herself to be defined by his assumptions. For the first time in a long while, she felt something akin to clarity. This wasn't the end of her fight. It was just another chapter. Nia took a deep breath, her mind now focused on the road ahead. As she reached the corner, she glanced back once, seeing Cartwright still standing there, his arms crossed, eyes staring into the distance. The encounter had left him unchanged, his mind still clouded by his biases, but it had left her with a renewed sense of purpose. She had not been broken. And if anything, the fight was far from over. Shifting the narrative. The cool evening air wrapped itself around Nia as she made her way down the street, her thoughts a whirlwind of anger, disbelief, and resolve. The confrontation with Sergeant Cartwright had left her shaken in ways she hadn't anticipated, despite the knowledge that these kinds of encounters were far too common. But the weight of the situation lingered, not because of the incident itself, but because of what it symbolized, how deeply ingrained bias still ran in the veins of the institution she had worked so hard to be a part of. Her mind drifted back to the countless cases she had seen throughout her career, the thousands of voices she had fought to amplify, voices from those who had been wronged, dismissed, or marginalized. And yet here she was again, forced to defend her dignity and her humanity in a situation that was, in its own way, a microcosm of the very injustice she had spent her life combating. Her pace quickened as she approached the corner where her friends had planned to meet her. The comforting thought of the evening ahead, the laughter, the camaraderie, was a welcome distraction from the lingering echoes of the encounter. But even as she imagined herself sitting down at the restaurant, the stress of the day melting away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in her. Something had shifted. The sidewalk seemed endless as she walked, her mind still battling with the memory of Cartwright's unwavering suspicion and his unwillingness to see her for who she truly was. Why did I have to go through that? The question gnawed at her, but it wasn't just about the evening. It was about the years of accumulated microaggressions, the subtle looks, the dismissive gestures, the moments when she had been seen as less than because of the color of her skin. As she neared the restaurant, she spotted her friends already waiting at the outdoor table, their animated conversations and laughter a stark contrast to the heavy, tense air that clung to her. "Hey, Nia. You're here." One of her friends, Kelly, waved excitedly, her blonde curls bouncing with each movement. The warmth of her smile made Nia feel momentarily lighter, but it didn't completely erase the lingering bitterness. "Yeah, just barely," Nia replied, forcing a smile as she slid into the seat across from Kelly. "Sorry I'm late. Got stopped by a cop on the way here." The words were out before she could stop them. She hadn't meant to mention it. She wasn't ready to relive the confrontation in front of her friends. Not yet, but the weight of the moment had pushed it to the forefront of her mind. "Wait, what? A cop?" Kelly's eyes widened. "What happened? Are you okay?" The concern in her voice made Nia pause. She hadn't realized how much she had internalized the event until she heard Kelly's immediate reaction. The questions, the worry, it all felt so distant from what she had experienced moments earlier. "I'm fine," Nia said quickly, her voice betraying the calm facade she had put on. "It was nothing. Just a misunderstanding." She waved it off, but her mind was elsewhere. But Kelly wasn't letting it go that easily. "Nia, you're not just going to brush this off. What happened?" Nia hesitated, looking down at her hands. She hadn't realized how much the tension from the street had drained her until now. Her fingers were slightly clenched, her shoulders rigid. She hadn't shared the details with anyone yet, not in full, and the thought of explaining the whole ordeal was exhausting. Yet in that moment, she realized that maybe, just maybe, talking about it could help her make sense of everything. With a deep breath, she leaned back in her chair, glancing at Kelly and the other friends around the table. "It wasn't just a misunderstanding," she began slowly. "It wasn't even just about being stopped. It was the fact that I was immediately seen as a threat. And the officer, Sergeant Cartwright, he didn't even take a second to consider that I was who I said I was. He just assumed." Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke, the weight of the emotion she had been carrying all day finally spilling over. "He treated me like I was a criminal for no other reason than the way I look. I was trying to be civil, trying to de-escalate, but it didn't matter. He didn't care." The table fell silent as her words sank in. The world outside their small bubble continued on, but for a few seconds, everything paused. Kelly reached out, gently placing her hand over Nia's. The gesture was simple, but it grounded Nia in a way she hadn't expected. "I can't even imagine," Kelly said softly. "I've never had to go through anything like that. It's just not right." Nia nodded, taking another breath. "I know," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. "And the thing is, I know it's not just me. I know this happens to so many others, in so many different forms. But when it happens to you, it just feels like everything you've worked for, everything you stand for, is suddenly irrelevant." Kelly and the others exchanged glances, clearly shaken by the gravity of Nia's words. But their concern wasn't just about her safety. It was about something bigger, something that had been brewing for a long time. It wasn't just the fact that Nia had been treated unfairly. It was that this moment was a glaring reflection of how systemic racism affected every aspect of her life, even in the moments when she wasn't fighting for someone else. One of her friends, Marissa, finally spoke up, her voice softer than usual. "Nia, you've been fighting against this for so long, but does it ever feel like you're winning? I mean, you're doing incredible things in the DA's office, but are we really changing things? Or is it just this constant battle that never ends?" The question caught Nia off guard, and for a moment, she couldn't answer. She had spent years pursuing justice, working tirelessly to dismantle the very systems of oppression that had created encounters like the one she'd just experienced. Yet here she was, sitting at a table with her friends, still feeling like she was fighting a battle she couldn't win. "I don't know anymore," Nia admitted quietly. "Some days it feels like we're moving forward, but other days it feels like we're just treading water, and I'm stuck in the same place, trying to prove that I deserve to be here, that I deserve to be treated with respect. I don't want to lose hope, but I'm starting to wonder if it's even possible to change something that's so deeply embedded in the fabric of our society." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, none of them knew how to respond. There was nothing anyone could say that could erase the years of frustration Nia had bottled up inside her. No words could undo the damage done by biases and systemic racism. But the one thing she knew, deep down, was that she couldn't stop fighting. Even when it felt hopeless, even when it felt like the world wasn't ready to change. The waiter arrived at the table, interrupting the silence, and for a moment, they all looked up, grateful for the distraction. Nea's friends did their best to change the mood, making light conversation about the menu and the events of the week. But Nea remained quiet, her thoughts still swirling, her mind still on the encounter that had turned her world upside down. But as they began to order, Nea couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in her. This wasn't just a setback, it was a catalyst, a moment that forced her to reevaluate her approach, to figure out how to not only fight the system, but how to change it. And if tonight had shown her anything, it was that she couldn't fight this battle alone. She would need the support of her friends, her colleagues, and the community that she had fought for all these years. Her resolve grew stronger as the evening went on, the laughter of her friends surrounding her like a shield. She wasn't done yet. There were still so many fights to win, so many wrongs to right. And with each step she took, no matter how difficult, she would be closer to turning the tide. The night had begun with a confrontation that shook her to the core, but it was ending with something far more significant, a renewed sense of purpose and the understanding that the fight for justice, for equality, was far from over. It wasn't just about proving her worth to those who doubted her. It was about proving to herself that she was strong enough to keep pushing, no matter how long the road ahead might be. Her journey had just begun, and this time, it felt different. This time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, ignored, or dismissed. And she would not rest until the system was held accountable for the harm it had done. The road to accountability. The days following the incident with Sergeant Cartwright felt like a whirlwind for Nea. The encounter had been unsettling, yes, but in many ways, it had been a wake-up call, one that stirred something deeper within her. As she returned to work at the district attorney's office, the weight of that night lingered, a constant reminder that despite her success, despite the respect she had earned in her career, there were still battles to fight, both in and outside the courtroom. It wasn't just about prosecuting criminals anymore. It was about confronting the biases and systems that had shaped the very society she worked within. Nea knew that her experience with Cartwright wasn't an isolated one. She had seen the news stories, heard the testimonies, and read the reports. She had seen the power dynamics at play, the unspoken rules that governed who was considered a suspect and who was afforded the benefit of the doubt. For years, she had fought to be seen as more than just a black woman in a professional environment that often felt like it didn't belong to people like her. But now, her fight was no longer confined to the courtroom. It was spilling out into the real world, where the assumptions and prejudices she had encountered behind closed doors were taking root in ways she hadn't anticipated. As Nea sat at her desk, reviewing the case file, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything she had been working toward needed a new direction. The weight of what had happened with Cartwright wasn't just about personal indignation. It was about the larger systemic issues that still plagued her profession and her community. She needed to confront the larger problem, not just the individuals who perpetuated it. Her phone buzzed on the desk, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her friend Kelly, who had been one of the first to hear about what had happened that night. Kelly: "Hey Nea, I've been thinking about what happened, and I feel like we should do something. There's an upcoming meeting with the local community outreach program. Maybe we can bring this up, talk about what happened. People need to hear your story. It could help make a change." Nea read the message twice, her fingers lingering on the screen. It wasn't the first time someone had suggested that she share her experience, but it had never felt so urgent. She had spent her entire career trying to make change through the legal system, but change wasn't always going to come from within those walls. It was going to come from the streets, from the communities that were affected by these systemic issues every day. Her phone buzzed again, this time from her colleague, Malik, a senior attorney in the office who had witnessed Nea's unwavering resolve for years. He had seen her fight for justice in ways that went beyond the courtroom. "Malik, let's have a conversation when you can. We need to figure out the next steps. I've been hearing about Cartwright's behavior, and I think we need to take action, not just for you, but for everyone he's put through this." Nia's heart sank as she read Malik's words. Cartwright's actions had, in a way, already been minimized. He had become just another cog in the machine, another example of the prejudice that plagued the system. But what if it didn't have to be like that? What if she could turn this moment into something that ignited real change? She could no longer be passive. She had the power to make this story more than just her own. With a deep breath, Nia set her phone down. It was time to take a stand. But she couldn't do it alone. She needed allies, people who understood that this wasn't just about one bad cop, one isolated incident. It was about a pattern. It was about a culture that needed to change. The following evening, Nia sat at a local cafe, the low hum of conversation around her almost soothing in its normalcy. Malik had suggested they meet to strategize, and now they were joined by a few other colleagues from the DA's office who shared her passion for reform. "I've thought about this a lot," Nia began, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup as she looked around the table. "This isn't just about Cartwright. I'm tired of being the only one who has to constantly prove my worth. I've had enough of being seen as an anomaly in a system that's supposed to protect us all." Malik nodded in agreement, his arms crossed as he listened intently. "I think it's time we start speaking out. We can't let this kind of thing slide any longer. People need to understand that the system doesn't just fail people of color, it actively targets them. What happened to you, Nia, is what happens every day in communities across the country." "I think you're right," said Lena, another attorney at the table who had worked in civil rights cases for years. "We've been fighting within the system for so long, but sometimes it feels like we're just spinning our wheels. Maybe it's time to take the fight to the people. What Cartwright did was a microcosm of the larger problem, and it's something that affects every black person in this community." Nia looked at the group, her resolve hardening with every word. "We need to make sure this doesn't end with a conversation. We need to push for action, real action. I want to start by filing an official complaint with the police department, but I want it to be more than just that. I want to bring this to the community. I want people to see how deep these issues run." Lena leaned forward, her eyes alight with the same passion Nia felt. "We could organize a town hall meeting, invite community leaders, local organizations, and activists. This could be our chance to start a conversation about the systemic issues that aren't being addressed. If we get the community involved, we might just have the momentum we need." Malik nodded thoughtfully. "A town hall could be a turning point. We can't just focus on the bad apple. We need to challenge the tree itself." Nia felt a sense of clarity wash over her. For the first time since the incident with Cartwright, she felt like she had a purpose, a direction that wasn't clouded by anger or frustration, but driven by the desire to make a real difference. It wasn't going to be easy. They were going to face resistance. But Nia had faced worse. She had fought for justice in the courtroom, and now she was ready to take the fight to a much larger stage. "We'll need to get the word out," Nia said, her voice firm. "Social media, local news, whatever it takes. But we need people to hear this story. We need them to see how the system is failing, and how it's not just one officer. It's the culture that sustains people like Cartwright." As the conversation continued, Nia could feel the weight of the task ahead. It wasn't just about taking on a single officer. It was about taking on an entire system of inequality and bias. But as the group brainstormed strategies and mapped out their plan of action, she realized that this moment, this painful, humiliating experience, could be the catalyst for something much larger than she had ever imagined. By the time the meeting ended, Nia felt a surge of energy she hadn't felt in days. The feeling of being heard, of having a team of people who understood the magnitude of the work ahead, was empowering. They were no longer just talking about change. They were planning it. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and preparations. Nia worked closely with Malik, Lena, and their colleagues to gather support from local activists, organizations, and even a few sympathetic officers within the force who had begun to recognize the flaws in the system. They reached out to the media, hoping to gain traction for their cause. When the day of the town hall arrived, the room was packed. Community members, local leaders, activists, and even a few reporters had shown up to hear what Nia and her team had to say. The air was thick with anticipation. It was the first time Nia had spoken publicly about the encounter with Cartwright, but it wasn't just her story. It was the story of every person who had been unjustly targeted, who had been forced to prove their worth in a system that was designed to see them as less than. As Nia took the stage, she felt a mix of nervousness and strength. But as she began to speak, the words flowed with a conviction that surprised even her. This wasn't just about what had happened that night. It was about a larger reckoning, a reckoning that had been a long time coming. "This isn't just about one bad cop," Nia began, her voice steady and clear. "This is about a system that perpetuates biases, that makes people like me, people like you, feel like we have to fight just to be seen as human. It's time we stop making excuses for the things that are broken. It's time to demand change. It's time to make them hear us." The room erupted into applause, and Nia knew then that this was only the beginning. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in her career she wasn't fighting alone. And together, they were going to make sure that the truth was heard. The ripple effect. The town hall meeting had ignited something within the community, a spark that had been waiting to catch fire. The powerful voices of those who had long been silenced now had a platform, and Nia felt the full weight of their collective pain and hope as the room echoed with applause after her speech. As she stepped off the stage, she was overwhelmed, not by the praise, but by the realization that she had started something bigger than herself, something that couldn't be undone. Weeks had passed since the meeting, but the momentum hadn't slowed. The story of Nia's encounter with Sergeant Cartwright and the subsequent call for systemic change had spread far beyond the town of Willowbrook. News outlets picked up the story, amplifying her voice and shedding light on the issues that had long been swept under the rug. The outrage over Cartwright's actions, coupled with Nia's courage to stand up and demand accountability, had sparked conversations not just in Willowbrook, but across the country. The pressure was mounting on local law enforcement. A formal investigation was launched into Sergeant Cartwright's behavior, and while the outcome remained uncertain, one thing was clear. The system was starting to acknowledge the problem. The police chief, whose silence had been deafening at first, finally made a public statement, pledging reforms and expressing his commitment to addressing the biases that had been so deeply embedded in his department. Nia had hoped for this, but even she hadn't anticipated the scale of the ripple effect. Every day, more voices joined the conversation. People who had been afraid to speak out for fear of retaliation or dismissal now felt emboldened to share their own stories of discrimination and injustice. The conversations weren't just happening in boardrooms or police precincts. They were happening at kitchen tables, in schools, and on social media platforms where people were demanding real change. One evening, Nia received a call from an old colleague, Ethan, who worked in the public defender's office. His voice was tight with excitement and urgency. "Nia," he said, his words tumbling out, "you won't believe this, but I just got off the phone with a group of defense attorneys and civil rights activists in the city. They want to meet with you. They want to use your case, the one with Cartwright, as a springboard for a larger initiative. They're talking about organizing protests, starting petitions, and putting pressure on local lawmakers to implement police reform." Nia sat back in her chair, her mind spinning. This was the kind of movement she had always dreamed of, one that went beyond just her personal experience and addressed the wider systemic issues that affected so many others. "This is happening, Nia," Ethan continued. "This isn't just talk anymore. People are waking up. They're seeing what we've been dealing with for years, and they're ready to take action." The phone call ended, but Nia sat in stunned silence for several moments. It wasn't just the national conversation that had shifted. It was the community's awareness of the issue. The ripple she had set into motion was reaching far and wide, gathering strength with each new voice that joined the fight. In the days that followed, Naya spent hours in meetings, phone calls, and strategy sessions with activists, legal advocates, and public officials. The team of individuals who had rallied behind her had grown exponentially, and the initiative to push for police reform was gaining traction. One of the first actions was the creation of a petition demanding that local law enforcement undergo racial sensitivity and bias training. The petition quickly gained thousands of signatures, showing just how widespread the desire for change was. The momentum was palpable. Protesters took to the streets, chanting for justice, for accountability, and for an end to racial profiling. It wasn't just a protest for Nia. It was a protest for every individual who had been mistreated, misjudged, or ignored by the system. It was a fight for equity in a world that had long been unequal. One afternoon, Nia found herself at a press conference, standing before a sea of reporters with a microphone in her hand. It had been a week since the town hall, and the pressure on local law enforcement had only increased. The mayor had announced a task force to examine the racial biases within the police department, and several officers had begun to speak out, acknowledging the need for change. Nia, what would you say to people who are still skeptical of the progress that's being made? A reporter asked, her voice sharp. Nia took a deep breath, steadying herself. The question was one she had anticipated, and it was one that required careful thought. The changes that were happening were significant, but Nia knew that the fight was far from over. It wasn't enough to hold one officer accountable. The system needed to be overhauled, not just in Willowbrook, but across the nation. I would say this, Nia began, her voice calm but resolute. This is not the end. This is just the beginning. The real work lies in how we change the culture. How we ensure that people who look like me aren't treated differently because of their skin color. We're not just fighting for justice for one person, one case, or one incident. We're fighting for every single person who has ever been mistreated by this system. The work that needs to be done goes beyond policy changes. It's about changing hearts and minds. It's about ensuring that people in positions of power understand that their biases have real consequences. Her words hit their mark. The reporters scribbled in their notebooks. The cameras clicked and flashed. But Nia didn't flinch. This was the fight she had chosen, and it was one she would see through until the end. She wasn't fighting just for herself anymore. She was fighting for every black man, woman, and child who had been wronged. Back at the district attorney's office, Nia sat at her desk, exhausted but satisfied. Her work on the police reform initiative had intensified, but she still managed to find time to prepare for upcoming cases. As much as the movement around her was growing, Nia was determined not to lose sight of her purpose as a prosecutor. She wasn't just fighting for change within the police department. She was fighting to make sure that the legal system itself was fair, just, and equitable for everyone. One morning, as she reviewed case files, a knock on her office door broke her concentration. She looked up to see Malik standing there, a small smile on his face. "Got a minute?" he asked. "Always for you," Nia replied, setting down the file. Malik stepped into her office and closed the door behind him. "I've been thinking," Malik began, sitting down across from her. "You've done something extraordinary. You've started a movement, and you've done it with grace, with dignity, and with a fierce determination. But I also know how hard it is to carry that weight, so I want to make sure you're taking care of yourself too." Nia met his gaze, her eyes softening. "I'm not sure how to do that," she confessed. "There's so much work to be done, and I don't feel like I can rest until we've made real change. But every day feels like another fight, and sometimes I wonder if it will ever be enough." Malik nodded, understanding. "It will never be enough if we try to carry it all alone. But you've got people, Nia, people who support you, who believe in the work you're doing. And when this is over, when the reforms are in place and the system has changed, you'll know that it was worth it. But right now, Right now, you need to let others help carry the load. Nia sat in silence for a moment, considering his words. It was hard to let go of the constant pressure to do more, to be more. But Malik was right. The work had to be shared if it was ever going to truly be sustained. She had to learn to trust the process, and more importantly, to trust the people who had stood by her every step of the way. "I'm learning," Nia said softly, a quiet resolve in her voice. "I'm learning that I don't have to do this alone. And that's something I've never really understood until now." Malik smiled. "We'll be here every step of the way. But for now, take a deep breath. You've done more than most people could ever dream of, but you deserve to be able to breathe too." As Nia looked out the window, her heart lightened just a little. The fight was far from over, but she was no longer carrying it alone. The people of Willowbrook, and the countless others who had been inspired by her bravery, were standing beside her. Together, they would continue pushing for the changes that would ensure justice for all. This was just the beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next.